Greetings, and today a little addendum to one of my earlier videos. There were some interesting discussions in the comment section on government grants and funding or subsidizing for small and medium companies. So the question for this video is then, is funding like that from the government always a bad idea, specifically if funding comes from the government? Well, theoretically, no, it is not, or rather it should not be controversial or bad. But in my humble opinion, getting the government involved in any project or company or anything usually comes with strings attached, and or it skews the market in a way that is not natural to common supply and demand, as in it negatively impacts free markets and usually ends up hurting the companies that take the money. Let's say you get a grant for your project. You get an investor through that supplied government money, and of course an investor doesn't really necessarily care where the money comes from. If it's government money, even better, because that usually means it's easily abused. But don't believe for a second that an investor won't drop any company like a hot potato if things don't work out, especially if they know your project is essentially backed by nothing. There is no real market behind it. What happens if your company would never be viable on the free market, and the only reason you even existed there for the short amount of time was only due to that taxpayer money? And usually these companies end up bankrupt one way or another, especially once the taxpayer well dries up, maybe because other projects take precedent, a political shift happens, a crisis happens, and so on and so forth. There could be a million reasons. If you get propped up on government funds alone, it usually leads to unnatural growth for products that would normally never be able to compete on the market. And in the case of video games, let's also take into account that we are in a very divisive time, politically and socially speaking. So any product within the games industry that has direct government funding and also comes across as pushing an agenda, usually in a specific political direction, anyone who figures this out will look unfavorably towards that specific product, as they feel like the government is trying to placate and propagandize them with their own money, no less. Sure, I would agree that some of the outrage is very selective. We have heaps of beloved or popular games that nobody is complaining about. All of these games got some sort of government funding. Hollow Knight, for example, Enshrouded, The Witcher 3, Cyberpunk. All of these games got some sort of government funding. But then you also obviously got games like The Medium from Bloober Teams. Man, we have to talk about The Medium and Bloober Team in general at some point in time. I don't have time for this at this point, but that company is a rabbit hole in and of itself. And then, of course, you have Dustborn and recently Mixtape. Essentially, we have positive and negative examples, or good and bad games, beloved games and hated games. And as expected, people get mad at the bad games because most of the time they're nagging, they're kind of finger wagging at you, they're woke-splaining, they're kind of propaganda-esque games. Not directly propaganda games, but if you look into the story and some of the vibes, it sure feels like this is government-sponsored propaganda. That's unfortunately just how reality works. Nobody complains when a product is actually good, and the product doesn't lecture you like you're some sort of child. But then also the media hype and the fake support for some of these products does even more harm and contributes even more to the backlash that some of these games are getting. If Mixtape just came and went, likely not many people would have even batted an eye. Nobody would have cared. We all would have likely moved on, or we would have never known that the game even existed. It was precisely and only the overzealous gaming press that put the game in the limelight for everyone to see. Because all of this felt way too unnatural. And I wanna at this point say it's not just angry chuds, quotation marks, that are getting outraged. That's a false assumption. It was the gaming press that made the game into the drama magnet that it became. It wasn't just random right-wingers on the internet. Similarly how Geoff Keighley made Highguard into the giant media flop it turned out to be. Highguard would have come and gone pretty quietly, but Geoff just had to give it a special spot at the Game Awards and essentially blew the entire game up. So it's a combination. It's always a combination of fake, astroturfed feeling success in combination with a woke or an off-putting, a propagandizing story, a weird feel about the game, and then in addition to that, the government funding in the background. All of this comes together to make this combination where people are very, very negatively predisposed. In all of these cases, it's not just simply government money being involved in the project. It is precisely the way these games are always played out. The marketing, the overhyping, the messages, the political spin, all of that is what pisses people off. It is not just the taxpayer money, it is just an additional insult on top of the shit pile. And also, let's be totally honest here for a moment. Do you think that a game like Postal 2 would have ever seen a single cent from any government fund out there, no matter which region of the world? No, it's always those types of games that seemingly get government funding. Why? Well, it's because to a certain point, I believe, these games fall precisely into what the government wants to show the citizens of their country in the first place. It is government-approved propaganda. To a certain extent. Obviously not all the time. Unless we are talking about culturally enriching stories, culturally enriching art, like The Witcher, for example, which is based on an extremely famous book, which is also based on the Elric saga, but let's ignore that. But in so many other cases, it feels like only projects that play into that specific ideal that the government would have already accepted politically and socially, those games get easy funding, and the rest of the games is kind of just hung out to dry. Tell me, how is a story about a 90s kid in America culturally enriching to people in Australia? Explain how that works out. That's the problem. It is funding for a game that doesn't even contribute to the culture of the country that the game was produced in. Maybe people wouldn't have been so pissed at this game if it at least took place, supposedly, in Australia or somehow reflected Australian culture of the 90s in a specific way, was based in a famous locale, whatever. If there was some sort of cultural enrichment present in the game, maybe then people would have looked at the game and went, you know, at least my taxpayer money went into a game that tells a story about my country, not an idealistic story about American 90s kids. That is just one aspect though. I will talk about this one later because the idealistic point is very, very pivotal as to why I personally believe government funding is always a bad idea. The ideology that plays into some of the decisions. Let's also not forget that instead of putting money into those projects, taxpayer money could instead be used for literally anything else. That is obviously another point of grief for some people. It is the realization that they funded something with their taxpayer money that they have no interest in, they don't identify with, and it also mockingly is presented to them as quote unquote the best thing ever. Of course, that would make people angry, at least. So in my opinion, government funding, especially if excessive, leads to skewed markets. It ruins industries and it just pisses people off. And it comes across as finger wagging from the government, no less. It's like, let me teach you about certain things, young man, through this type of media that we have approved, and you will see it, we will say it's good, and we have paid for it. In reality, obviously, the real price is paid by you and me, because we fund the government. Do you understand why people get pissed at stuff like this now? In addition, I would like to give you 3 examples as to why I think that government funding is always a bad idea. 2 of these examples have nothing to do with the entertainment industry, and 1, the last example, is very, very much related to entertainment. And in addition, since I was called out as a foreign hater, and I understand that some bundle of sticks bashing a foreign country might upset some people, I will only talk about my country in these examples. I can do some Germany bashing too, I have no problems with that. So let's get started. Number 1, German government funding for wind turbines. State money, as in taxpayer money, and regulatory manipulation of markets and innovation into technology through the state does not create a healthy and effective industry or a normal market. That is why why wind energy is mostly seen as literal hot air. Without the government money behind it, it would be nothing. Instead of trying and letting a market develop and grow naturally, it just has government money pumped into it aggressively, artificially making it seem economically viable, even though it isn't. Therefore, any innovations within that sector are extremely risky, as the actual demand for this technology seems to not be present. Needless to say that additionally, the areas where German wind turbines are being built, the land, is not always ideal for maximum efficiency and energy production. Thus, in a few years, we will end up with broken down trash dumps on our mountain ranges, as inevitably these turbines will break down and will be decommissioned. An undertaking that we will pay for again as taxpayers. So we pay for the investment, the construction, the necessary deforestation to build these turbines, the electricity bill, the maintenance, and eventually the decommissioning of these machines. All the while, they either don't produce enough energy or their produced energy cannot be utilized correctly. Let's also take into account that while Germany has a lot of bad weather, it is not a particularly windy country, especially in the southern area. Close to the sea, sure, I can understand why, but these turbines are built everywhere, partially on random small hills and in random small mountain ranges, which obviously also destroys the panorama view you would usually have without these turbines. Let's also take into account that they just look ugly. And in the end, the concrete base of these turbines will remain in the ground, as removing that would be an insane amount of costs, money and investment, and no company will do that, at least none of the companies that built these in the first place, unless once again it's paid by the government, so by the taxpayer. Basically, we ruin our natural forests with these monstrosities for not much of an outcome. Due to government subsidizing, a lot of opportunistic companies and investors jump in on the fake trend and build heaps and heaps of wind turbines everywhere. That is why so many of them kind of look slightly different from each other, because they are built by that company and this company. So many companies build different turbines because they got the taxpayer grant for their project. They don't give a single shit if the technology is actually worth investing in or what happens to these turbines in 30 years. They're just here for that sweet government money. No other reason. The most insane project was a deforestation attempt of the Berlin Park in order to plant a bunch of wind turbines in the middle of Berlin. Imagine you wake up and you look outside of the window, and instead of seeing a natural park, you see an ugly wind park outside. Now, thankfully, that project died, but the thought alone is insane. And in the end, the only real risk is taken by the taxpayers, because we eventually pay for all of that. None of these renewable energies are capable of competing on the normal market without government subsidizing, or at least they are not giving the chance to compete on a normal market. A machine like a wind turbine would have to generate worth, as in money, under normal market conditions, which is not the case for subsidized technologies. And the owner of a wind turbine or a wind turbine park gets a fixed, subsidized amount of money from the government, independent of how much the wind turbines are actually producing. And all of that skews the market and generates huge bubbles that eventually will pop once the government funding gets redirected, which it will. That could kill entire industries that have been raised on nothing but taxpayer money. Not to mention that the additional bureaucracy nightmare fuel that comes with all of these government grants. Yeah, all of that stuff needs to be approved by someone. By the way, that's not a joke. Companies have raised themselves up on government funds alone, usually in these green energy sectors. And without fail, they go bankrupt the moment it gets dicey for the state and funding is cut, because then all of the investors run away. You really have to ask yourself how you can run headlong into such an obvious risk with your entire company. I guess taxpayer money is easy money, and maybe that clouds the human judgment, perhaps. Number 2, government funding for electric cars. And then we have our beautiful electric cars. There are giant companies that received government grants, sold their batteries to car manufacturers, then went bankrupt, and the affected car manufacturers that bought these batteries had to switch over to Chinese products, which is kind of funny to say. That is the effect of raising up fake companies on government money. These companies are not capable of existing on a market naturally, and the money they got without their substitution is useless. They falter, and that faltering has potentially negative effects on other companies that have made themselves reliant or have made deals with the company that was just kind of raised up by the government, or they're reliant on their products somehow. In addition to all of that, the subsidized money was used to pump our taxpayer money into the German car industry to produce more electric cars. All of that was done without even thinking about the reality, whether these cars would even be bought or not. In addition to that, German electric cars are way too expensive and cannot be considered a viable alternative to normal cars at any point in time, not back then and not now. Thus, without taking supply and demand into account, German car manufacturers built expensive electric cars with government subsidized money that in the end no German wanted to buy or could buy. And now that same car industry is slowly but surely going under. We had Volkswagen close down a production plant. Imagine that. That is a historic event that has never happened before. 2025 marked the first time the company Volkswagen has ever completely shut down a manufacturing site since 88 years. Germany is supposed to be the car country. In addition, there are subsidized prices and a premium for people who do actually end up buying electric cars, usually more affluent people. However, in the end, those people end up paying just as much if they had bought the electric car at full price. And also, talking about subsidized prices and premiums, did you know that in Germany about 610 million euros of taxpayer money just poof went up in flames, as in it completely left the country? Why? Well, because people bought subsidized electric cars, got a premium for buying them. They got about a 6 to 12 month leasing contract. They never drove these cars, and then they sold them at a bonus into the foreign markets outside of Germany to make some extra money on top of the government grants they got for buying an electric car in the first place. That is what happens when a state aggressively subsidizes an industry. And making the minimum holding time for an electric car 36 months is not the right response, and it's not going to change the fact that savvy people will continue to take advantage of the government supplied funds. Also, if you make just a little bit too much money, you don't get that premium for buying an electric car from the government because you are considered too rich. But your taxpayer money will still be used to subsidize others, giving them a bonus for buying electric cars that make an arbitrary number of money less than you. That sounds very fair and logical. That is socialism, by the way, and the reason why it inevitably always fails. Number 3. And finally, the German movie industry. Let's talk about German movies. Since this is closer related to the entertainment industry of video games, it just makes sense. As you know, supposedly, Germany was once known as the country of poets and thinkers. That is literally a saying, that's not something I just came up with. So, when was the last time you saw a German movie on the big picture? Who is the most famous German actor you know besides that one guy? So what happened to the industry? An industry like the German movies. Why did they regress to a point where they cannot exist on their own anymore? In the USA, movies are produced like fine pieces of art and then they are marketed like merchandise. In Germany, it is the complete opposite. Germans want light entertainment, heaps of it, and ideally comedic. Interestingly enough, as opposed to American comedians that actually got some big movie gigs, German comedy always stayed small and simple, or rather very minimalistic. Only few comedians got big acting roles or were ever used in serious or more mainstream productions. Germans don't actually like going to the cinema too, if you wanted to know that, and even less if it's German movies. There's a severe lack of innovation within German movies in general, and there's an aggressive trend chasing going on. It's one of the biggest issues within German cinema. There are just not a lot of potential stories present because classical genres, like we all know them, they don't really exist in German cinema unless we are talking about amateur or indie movie productions. The German movie industry is suffering from a very systematic weakness, a systemic failure, and that is called the German film subsidies. A few small numbers of decision makers do in fact decide where the money goes, which projects get funding and which do not. And since it's drawing from the German taxpayer money, the options for movies are limited by a committee. So why do we even need government grants and subsidized money for movies in the first place? Well, it's because Germany never built a studio landscape or a studio industry landscape like it exists in the USA, for example. Studios that take responsibilities for success and failure of a movie. The industry does simply not exist. There is no Warner Brothers. There is no Disney or Paramount equivalent. Likely because due to very early government subsidies and grants, it was never lucrative or necessary to build a movie studio landscape. It's kind of a viciously repeating cycle or a snake eating its own tail. Government subsidies do not inspire innovation or the formation of independent industries that could produce movies on their own. Producers and marketing departments of movies barely get any money back from movies, even if they are successful. The only time these people make money is through the sales of Blu-rays or DVDs after the movie release. While the movies are in cinema, they won't make significant money for the producers. So we are at a point where without government grants, it is very likely that there would be no German movie industry anymore. Nada. But the constant subsidizing of movies also does not help to create a more stable market landscape in Germany. So this is just a never-ending cycle. There's basically an ice age happening. There is no moving forward, no moving backward, no real innovation. It just sits and runs on a treadmill, stuck on a single point. Unless the entire system would be reset and be remade from the ground up. That's the only way I see this working out. Let's also talk about why movie subsidizing is so hated, even by Germans, even though it's literally the only guarantee that guarantees we get movies in the first place. It's just one word, and you know what it is: bureaucracy. You have to apply your movie project and get it evaluated, judged, and approved by an unknown number of bureaucratic nightmare institutions until you maybe get the green light. It takes up to 6 years until a movie could be approved or denied. And before that happens, you know absolutely nothing about the status of your movie project. In addition, there are metric tons of movie grant institutions. It is not just one national institution. Each county has their own. And if you get funding from a specific county, you are locked in. You are to film, market, and produce your movie in and from that region. Your production is automatically region locked. So a bunch of random guys end up making decisions about movies and art. People who have never made a movie, have no idea about the ins and outs of movie making. They're just responsible for the bureaucratic process. That means exactly what you think it does. If one random guy sitting in an office chair does not like your movie project due to personal reasons, you're fucked. So indeed, the German movie industry hinges on the personal taste of a few people who have no idea what a good movie actually is. And these people can sit in these positions for 10 to 20 years, shaping the movie industry. 90% of all of these decisions, by the way, are not made for the sake of the art, but they are made due to economic reasons. That means if you had one successful project, you will automatically get funding from the government for your second project, no matter how good your second project or your third project is. Because the government money is conditional. Namely, if your movie exceeds a predetermined number of views, income, and success, usually agreed upon before the movie is released and the money is given out, you have to pay back a certain amount of money to the government. So once a project is lucrative, they give you money again because they expect you to have a second successful project, which means they get money back. So yet another economic reason that influences the government grants and why it's so difficult to get your foot in the door with an unknown project. But here's another funny joke. American studios, giant ass American studios, produce some of their blockbuster hits in Germany to, yes, you guessed it, get some of that sweet, sweet government grant money. Yup, there are movies made by giant American studios that still get money from the German taxpayer since they deliberately filmed scenes or have their post-productions set in Germany to get their hands on that subsidized money. And of course, Germany hands out giant sums of money for the big Hollywood studios since success is nearly guaranteed in these cases, which means they get a heap ton of money back. But this skews the entire media landscape of the country. That is a government subsidizing the budget of an American studio that could just pay for the production costs without getting government grants. We have Hunger Games, The Grand Budapest Hotel, Aquaman, the Uncharted movie, Shazam 2, The Crow, and many others. All of these movies got taxpayer money for either producing in Germany or just having parts of their post-production set in Germany somehow. So the German movie subsidizing organization is not really an art and culture supporting endeavor. It is rather a simple economic support system for the country, for the government. That is why I don't think government funding is always a good idea. Maybe within reason, maybe, but a state can do so much damage within an industry by artificially funding projects that are not actually competitive, and on the other hand, they can put a stranglehold on an industry and an art form that almost entirely smothers it. With video games, of course, it's less impactful, but it's still the same principle. The ideal solution should be that the state at least is not an obstacle to a company when that company wants to contribute to the market and the economy. At least don't be an obstacle, which the state usually is too. When the state intervenes, there are usually strings attached and the final result is rarely a good one. So while I don't think government grants are always fundamentally bad in any scenario, personally I think dancing to the tune of the government is rarely a good idea, and in some cases it can heavily damage your project, your economic sector, your company, and art and culture. And when it comes to video games, we really don't need more damage to the games industry at this point in time. Thanks for listening and see you next time.